Heavenly Father, please remind us of our dignity, the dignity that you have given to us, to help us live out what it means to be followers of your Son, followers of Jesus Christ. To see him in others, to love him in others, to receive the love that you give to us as well. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you.
Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So actually, before I forget, and this does actually tie into Catholic social teaching in a sense, but today is the feast of St. John Paul II. Pope Saint? It's Pope Saint. It always throws me off. I should know better by now. But it's Pope St. John Paul II, who, as I look around the room, I think most of us remember at least some point in our lives when he was there, and even perhaps some of the younger folks that are here tonight, you at least remember hearing about him, if you don't remember much about his papacy. Without going too much into details, he actually passed away about a year or two before I became Catholic. I was a non-denominational, evangelical Christian at the time. That's what I fancied myself. Something I was a Bible thumper, and I was a good Bible thumper. And this, I think, just kind of goes to show how the love of Jesus Christ can destroy barriers that we like to put up in place. Because I remember, as a non-Catholic Christian, upon hearing when Pope John Paul II died, I remember being deeply saddened. And I remember thinking, we just lost our shepherd. Think about that. As an evangelical, Bible-thumping, non-denominational Christian, thinking to myself, I just lost my shepherd when I heard word that the Holy Father had passed away. That was the power of the love of Christ that animated his life, and the reason he's a saint. But one of the other things that made him a saint was actually this, believe it or not. We might remember, we're not going to have time to go into it, but his involvement in the Solidarity, I'm not good with the pronunciation of this, Solidarity movement, I think, in Poland, in Soviet Poland, that actually really was one of the big cogs, one of the big pieces. If you imagine the whole thing is like a game of Jenga, that was like one of the big blocks getting pulled out that eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Russia and communism in the Eastern Bloc. A big part of it was Pope John Paul II's support, his solidarity with the Solidarity movement in Poland. And we're not going to go into that too much detail tonight, partly because I don't understand Polish politics, but also partly because our focus tonight is going to be more on solidarity as virtue and as action, not the more social or political aspect of it. And what John Paul II did was both in that case, and it can be both, but we'll get there. But that was part of what he did. It was also his ability. He had an uncanny ability to recognize the dignity of every person he ever saw. One of our past bishops, Bishop Braun, who you remember he was in Minnesota for a long time. He was a priest there, and then he came down here to San Diego as our bishop several decades ago. And he told a story to all of us in the seminary one time about, because he had a couple of run-ins with both John Paul II and Mother Teresa during his time as a bishop. And he told this one story that when he first was ordained a bishop, when they first ordained you to a bishop, you go out to what they call, jokingly, baby bishop school in Rome. And you go out there and you do some stuff, it's like, okay, here's how to not totally screw up as a bishop, I guess. And I'm never going to go, so who cares? But then you go out to like baby bishop school and they teach you how to not screw things up. And so he was out there and he went through the whole course and everything else. And at the end, I guess they all have an audience with the Pope, and the Pope comes around and greets each and every one of them, and welcomes them into the fraternity of bishops. And there's some other stuff. But they go around, and John Paul II is getting introduced. Oh, and this is Robert Brom from Minnesota. And John Paul II looks at Bishop Brom and said, Robert Brom from Minnesota, we have met before. Really, I just want an excuse to pretend to use my giant P2 accent. He said, we have met before. And Bishop Brom said, no, Holy Father, we haven't. No, I'm pretty sure we have met. Holy Father, I think I would remember if I met you. We haven't met before. John Paul II gave him a kind of funny look. Okay, went along. Well, afterwards, he had to sign some form or get some paper. So he goes up there, and the Pope's secretary is going through. He says, oh, Bishop Robert Brom. Well, here's your paper and sign here and everything. But before you go, two other quick admin notes for you. Okay, what are they? He said, well, first, never contradict the Holy Father. JP2 he was a very strong Pope. He said, never contradict the Holy Father. That's the first thing. He said, the second thing is that you have met him before. So do you remember when you were a seminarian in Rome about 35 years ago, and you were walking back from university one afternoon, and you ran into some of your Polish classmates, and their archbishop was visiting them all the way from Krakow. And you met outside the doors of this church of, I think, Santa Maria Sopra Minerva, and they introduced you to their bishop, their Archbishop Karol Wojtyła. And they said, oh, and they introduced you, Robert Brom from Minnesota. He met you. He remembered meeting you 30-some years later. Remembered meeting a random kid on the doors of a church in a country that neither of them were from. Complete recall. Because you see a couple of my altar servers here, they will vouch for me on this one. Vouch is the wrong word. They will roll me under the bus on this one. I have trouble remembering their names, and I see them all the time. Karol Wojtyła could meet you once, and he would remember everything about you, because he recognized Christ. When he saw you, he saw Jesus Christ. When he saw you, he loved you like Jesus Christ, because he saw your dignity, he saw your worth. That's the other reason why he's a saint. Not just because he was super smart, okay, that's true, but the way he loved, the totality with which he loved. So even if you're not good with names, like this guy up here, do we love with the totality of our hearts? Can we recognize the dignity of other people the way he did? And he would recognize it in such a profound way that he wouldn't forget you. And think of all the hundreds of thousands, all the millions of people that he met, and he remembered every one of them. That's special. So, St. John Paul II, pray for us. Very quickly here, though, subsidiarity and solidarity. And, like I said, we'll get to that. So subsidiarity, again, we'll hit this one maybe a little too quickly, but I just don't think there's that. Subsidiarity might be, out of all the parts of Catholic teachings, Catholic social teaching, it might be the most consistent one. In terms of, like, there hasn't really been a lot of extra stuff said about it, or a lot of stuff that's kind of changed the root. It's always been like, no, this is kind of what we've always taught. Not what we've always practiced, but what we've always taught. Okay? And this actually is rooted all the way back in the Old Testament. Okay, in Exodus, from Exodus, the idea behind subsidiarity, again, if you want to reduce it to just a single, oversimplified to a single word definition, you would just say delegation. It's not just delegation. The idea is that we don't ask someone at a higher level to handle what could be handled at a lower level. So again, we were just talking about Pope John Paul II. I suspect that at no time when he was the pastor here did Monsignor Dolan ever call the Vatican and ask Pope John Paul II for help here at St. Michael's. And if he had, John Paul II would have been like, Father, figure it out. That's subsidiarity. It's the idea is like, we don't handle at the parish level what could be handled at the ministry level. We don't handle at the diocesan level what could be handled at the parish level. We don't handle at the Vatican level what could be handled at the diocesan level. That's subsidiarity. It's like you're going to trust the people below you to act virtuously, essentially. That requires well-formed consciences, that requires a good understanding of the virtues, a good understanding of what it means to be Catholic and to act Catholic and to follow Christ. But can I trust the people whom I have appointed for governance, whatever position, laity all the way on up to the Holy Father, can I trust them to do what they've been appointed to do? Right? And again, the roots of this can be found in the Old Testament. So we recall that in the book of Exodus, the Israelites, the children of Israel, have left Egypt, and they get out to Mount Sinai, or out to the region where Moses had been used to work for his father-in-law and herd sheep. And he gets out there, and he's just bogged down, because he wakes up in the morning, and from morning until early in the morning till very late at night, literally his whole day is just sitting around and being an arbitrator for everyone's problems. And we're told that there were upwards of 1 million people there. You can imagine how many problems that is. That was all he was doing all day. It was just being basically this kind of judge for everyone and all their little things. And his father-in-law comes in and he's like, Moses, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm trying to lead the people. He's like, yeah, and you're doing an awful job at it. Stop. You're going to kill yourself. He doesn't say that. He says, you're going to burn yourself out. So you can't do this. You can't keep this up. So he has, okay, you appoint like groups, leaders of 10, leaders of 100, leaders of 50, there are leaders of 10, 50, 100, I think, and then 1,000, and so on and so forth. And you would trust them for that. And that way, only the big things will you step in and be the judge of. Only the big issues that they can't handle, that's your responsibility. By the way, you see kind of a little bit of an echo of this in the New Testament, in Acts. Right? It's not exactly one for one here, but you think about the office of deacons, where they came from. You guys remember? So the apostles were responsible for all this stuff that was going on in the new church, but the new church was growing. It was growing really quickly. It was growing too fast for them to keep up. So what do? Well, they realized there were complaints coming in that it says the Greeks. So it's the Hellenistic Jews. There were two types of Jews back then. There were the Jews that were from Judea, you might say the Canaanite Jews, and you had the Hellenistic Jews, the Jews from the diaspora Jews. They were from everywhere else around the Roman Empire. So you had the Canaanite Jews, their first language was Aramaic, and then you had the Hellenistic Jews, Hellenistic Jews, their first language was Greek. So when they talk about that at the very beginning of Acts, before the Gentiles were part of that, that's what they're referring to, probably. But the Hellenistic Jews that were in the area that were joining the church, they were saying the widows in our group are getting overlooked. You're forgetting about us. There was a whole group of people in the church that was getting overlooked by the existing ministries. Oh golly, that's never happened before, right? There's a whole demographic in the church that just gets overlooked by existing ministries, or non-existing ministries rather. That's never happened before. We were talking about focus earlier this evening, before we got started here. I mean, like, that's kind of what's going on here. There's a whole group of people, and no one's reaching out to them. And the apostle sat down and said, it's not good for us to stop doing what we are doing here. We need to keep doing that part of our ministry, but you're right, someone needs to do this. So they created the office of deacons. And they've been working hard ever since. Well, we hope they've been working hard ever since. Our deacons work hard here, but we hope the other ones do too. We've had the office of deacons ever since then. Actually, the office of priest was started similarly. We remember the apostles, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds in this one, We say the apostles, so the office of the apostles, they were all bishops. Well, at some point, there were too many people, spread too far, and I think someone said, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to have this many bishops, but we do need extra people to do the work. So they created the office of presbyter, the priest. So in a kind of like a little bizarre twist in church history, actually deacons have been around the church longer than priests have. And they don't teach you that in catechesis, do they? Like in the CCD? Yeah, but deacons have actually been in the church longer than priests have. That's why, actually, not bishops have been around longer than either of them, but deacons existed before priests did. Strictly speaking. I mean, the bishops served as priests, they functioned as priests, but you guys get what I'm saying. So that's actually why, if you ever pay attention, total rabbit hole, we'll climb out of it. But if you ever go to a mass with the bishop, you'll notice who is not sitting next to him are the priests. The deacons sit next to the bishop at a mass. Because that's their privilege. They were there first. Their privilege, their job is to serve the bishop and to assist the bishop. My job, my calling is to serve and assist the bishop in his ministry and to be an extension of the bishop's ministry here in the local church. The deacon exists to assist the bishop in his ministry as well, but in a different way. But he came first. So if we have a mass and Bishop Dolan or Bishop McElroy comes over here, I can celebrate, but I don't get to sit next to him. That's for Deacon John and Deacon Terry. So, here's your cool little gee whiz, Catholic fact nugget for the day. But that's basically subsidiarity. And the idea behind it is subsidiarity is concerned with the individual being able to achieve fulfillment, right? And we see this. If someone 1,000 miles away who has no visibility on what's going on can't really tell me the best way to do something particular right here, right? So there's that. And that's the idea. It's like the person who is more intimately involved in what's going on, but still has the authority to be able to instruct me and to teach me, to show me the right way or the best way to do something, he has better eyes on, and he has a better ability to really kind of direct what's going on. Which is why, again, Monsignor never called up John Paul II and said, hey, what do I do now? Right? Because JP2 would have said, what are you calling me for? So, subsidiarity. Solidarity. Solidarity, we can think of as two different things. A social principle and as a virtue. I want to look primarily at the second one. Okay, it's a social principle. Okay, this is, again, how it will kind of play into politics as well, though the second way, de facto, can do that. But when we talk about solidarity as a virtue, right, we're not talking about it in the same vein as, say, faith, hope, and love, the theological virtues. We're not talking about it in the same vein as the cardinal virtues of prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. We're not talking about it in that kind of sense of a virtue, but we are talking about it as a virtue. What do we mean then? Well, when we say solidarity as a virtue, we are not talking about just a feeling of compassion. Right? Solidarity as virtue is not just a sappy sentiment that has no muscle. When we say solidarity as virtue, we mean action. Solidarity, if we were going to talk about solidarity as a virtue, it must be a verb. It is an action, not a sentiment, not a feeling. It can't be this general kind of shallow distress that I feel that someone else somewhere is having a bad day. That's not solidarity. Okay? It's not just this, again, the words actually that I received is, it's not just shallow distress at someone else's misfortune. Solidarity as virtue is a firm, solid, persevering determination to do the good, to do what is right. You see the difference between just feeling sorry for someone and the action of trying to correct it. The former is nonsensical and worthless sentiment. The latter is solidarity as virtue. A persevering determination to do what is right. Okay, but in a particular way, as I encounter another individual, or I encounter a group of people through an individual. Okay? And so it's that determination, that perseverance to do what is right, to do the good, to choose the good, whatever that means, whether it means giving money, whether it means giving time, whether it means helping out, getting my hands dirty, whether it means praying. We're going to talk about a couple other crazier examples today, like crossing no man's land. It can mean 1,000 different things for 1,000 different situations. The important thing, though, is that solidarity, if we want to think of it as a virtue, and I hope we do want it to become a virtue that we can live, must be an active virtue. It's an action, not a feeling. So most of the rest of the time this evening, I want to actually just talk about a few examples of solidarity that we can see in history. Because to be perfectly frank, and just total disclosure here, even up to probably, certainly about a decade or so ago, and perhaps even more recently than that, if you had said the word solidarity to me, I would have cringed. Maybe not visibly, maybe I would have a good poker face that day, but I would have cringed inside, certainly. And just kind of had to bite back on the gag reflex a little bit. Because my idea of solidarity was that first part, just this like wishy-washy sentiment. And so when someone said solidarity to me, what I immediately envisioned was, apologies out there if this rubs you the wrong way, but what I imagined was a group of hippies sitting around a campfire, holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and wishing the world's problems away on a cloud. And I was like, that is such utter nonsense. And if that's solidarity, I want nothing to do with it. Well, thank God that is not solidarity at all. As we said, solidarity is the action, the persevering action of doing the good, doing what's right. And when I started to realize that, and actually there's a couple of experiences I had, that I started to really recognize what authentic solidarity was, and I started to realize even, in a certain sense, without meaning to or intending to, I was actually living out solidarity in a certain sense in certain parts of my life, and watching that kind of transform how I approach certain things. It was a kind of transformative experience when I was able to take a step back and say, wow, like I've actually been living this without realizing it. And now I'm starting to understand more what that means. So two quick examples. The first was actually, I wasn't even thinking about this when I was writing the notes. It popped in my mind 30 seconds ago. But about immigration. Right? Before I moved out to San Diego, I didn't grow up around here. I thought about immigration in one way. It seemed like a pretty black and white topic to me. Even before I moved out here, there was about a year where I had a couple of roommates right after, about a year or so after college. We're all in the Marines. And one of the guys, he's a few years older, so he was married, and his wife was a naturalized citizen. She was from Eastern Europe. And this was one of the earlier times when immigration had started blowing up as an issue, and then we kind of shoved it off to the side, and it blew up again, and we shoved it off, and now it's blowing up like whatever, the fourth or fifth time in the last couple of decades. So this is all back around 06, 05, 06, maybe 06, I think it was about 06. And talking to one of my friends, John, his name was John, I can't remember his wife's name. See, I told you I'm bad with names. But she was from Eastern Europe, like Bosnia or Serbia. we had a bunch of, and she was Muslim too. I mean, this is like the craziest food of all, right? And so we're all sitting around, we're talking about the stuff of the immigration, and I realized that her take on that was very different from mine. But I also realized that her voice should count for at least as much as mine, if not more, as everyone was clamoring and starting to get their say in around the table. Because she had lived through something firsthand that I couldn't imagine. In that naturalization process. It was kind of interesting. Because on one hand, she was very sympathetic to many of the immigrants coming across the border. On another hand, she said, hey, I did things the right way. It was really, really hard. And so while she didn't want to deport everybody, she didn't want to put up a wall or do anything like that, but she also didn't want to reward people for breaking the rules. And it was actually, she said a couple things. It was the most reasonable thing I'd ever heard on the topic. And I remember thinking to myself, it's like, good Lord, why is no one in Washington asking immigrants their opinion on this thing? Like the people who've gone through the process. Hey, let's ask some people who've gone through the process. How is it broken? Is it broken? But that was a kind of eye-opening thing for me. Then I moved out here to San Diego. I got to meet a lot of people, talk to a lot of people. And then I joined the seminary here in San Diego, and I remember talking to a couple of priests who ministered to some of the communities out in some of the part of East County, where it's very largely Hispanic. And large portions of their parishes sometimes are illegal immigrants at times. Or they'll have a couple of people that they know are illegal immigrants that are coming there to the church. And hearing the pastoral issues that come up to these priests and how they try to balance all of this. Law and charity, Christ's law, the natural law, the civil law. I started realizing, wow, this is a lot more complicated than what me and my fairly entitled upbringing thought it was. And then I moved out, and then the best part, is then a few years later, I spent a few years out in Italy studying. I was an immigrant for 4 years. Now, I had no intention of becoming a naturalized citizen. Italy was great, but I didn't want to become a naturalized citizen. I wanted to come home. But I was an alien and a stranger in a foreign land for 4 years. And I had a lot of people helping me out. We had a system in place. We had several safety nets. And I still struggled. And it was hard. And oh my goodness, did that open my eyes even more. And I started realizing this conversation is bigger than what I thought. It's more complicated than what I thought. There's not an easy answer. There's not just a quick, here's the one snap fix. You snap your fingers and just do this and it'll all go away. It's a pretty naive assumption for both sides to say, this is the quick fix. Well, there is no quick fix because it's a super complicated issue. But I started realizing, like, I'm entering into solidarity as I move from my fixed position and start to understand. And I start to listen. And in this case, actually start to experience what it means. So that was one way. I think the other thing that kind of opened my eyes was actually, again, back when I was still active duty Marines, and it was, I guess my first deployment was kind of quick to pick up on this. I was mostly just running around the base. I was a logistics guy, so I was trying to square a couple accounts that weren't squaring up. That was not fun. But my second deployment, I went out there, and my job was, I was a truck platoon commander, so we called it motor transport. Reader's Digest version, someone thought it was a good idea to put a 23 or 24-year-old me in charge of 40 other Marines who I was older than almost all but like 2 or 3 of them, and give us several $1 million worth of expensive equipment and loaded weapons and say, please don't do anything stupid or illegal. Emphasis on the stupid. I look back, I'm like, wow, someone had a lot of faith in me that was probably a bit misplaced. But we made it through. And anyway, but that was a great time. It was one of the, I feel weird saying this, but it was one of the best years of my life. What? Yeah, I know, right? I spent a year over in Iraq, and we called it the sandbox. And, you know, I felt like I learned so much, about myself, about leadership, about the guys I was with. And without realizing it, I started learning a lot about this too. Because I did have a couple experiences like you kind of heard about, or you've seen some of the old World War II flicks where like here come the GIs and they give candy bars to the kids in Holland or France or whatever. We had a few moments like that, where we would stop for security halt. At first you're kind of on pins and needles. It's like, all right, someone have a flat tire, someone has something going, okay, we just have to stop here and just check out the area for a while. So we'd like check the perimeters, make sure there's no explosives buried nearby that we're going to get us. We had this certain thing we're doing, but as we're doing this, all of a sudden, you have like the kids from like a couple of the farms nearby just running across the fields, and they start coming towards us. And as soon as you started seeing them, you kind of like, whew. All right, I think we're okay here. Let's stay vigilant, guys. But the people always know what's going on, and the parents wouldn't let their kids run towards us if they thought anything was going to happen. So we're probably okay. Stay vigilant, but we're probably okay here. And then meanwhile, everyone who wasn't on watch, who wasn't keeping watch on security, which I guess all of us were kind of keeping security, but the guys who were actively on security, we'd then we'd go to the back of the trucks, we'd break out the extra water bottles, and we had Pop-Tarts on candy bars, and just some of the other stuff. You start giving it to the kids as they came up. And then other times there was, because the local sheiks started collaborating with the American military leaders. And so our commanding officer, our CO, would go over once in a while to the local sheik, and because they were helping us, they now became the main targets of the local insurgents. And the terrorists were now going after the local populace who were helping us. And so our commanding officer, our CO, would go and say, what do you need? How can I make your family safer? I said, well, we could use this and this and this. He said, you got it. So then he'd call me up and say, Lieutenant Exner, we need this and this and this and this. And I'm going back over, I'm going to have tea with the sheik, and you make sure you guys have all that stuff. So roger that, sir, we're on it. We like to jokingly refer to, when we did that a few times, we called it Operation Sheik's Crib. Like I said, whoever thought it was a good idea to put us in charge of this stuff, me in charge of this stuff, I don't know. We call it Operation, jokingly, it wasn't the official name, but we jokingly called it the platoon Operation Sheik's Crib. And we went back, had several different, so phase 1, phase 2, phase whatever. As often as we went back, we just kept adding Roman numerals at the end. Because Roman numerals made us feel smarter. But Operation Sheik's Crib, we kept going back there, it was a similar thing. So he'd go in and he'd drink tea with the sheik, and they would talk about stuff, the local politics and how to help out, and what are we going to build a school next, or are we going to rebuild the market next. And while we were out there, again, the kids would run up and we'd pass out Pop-Tarts and water after we unloaded all the other stuff. And we joke around, sometimes they'd point to stuff on our gear and ask for it. I'm like, no, I'm not giving you one of my magazines full of bullets. I'll give you this extra, I'll give you these spare batteries. You can have that. You can't have this. Right? But I started realizing through that, as we saw them on occasion, you'd see some of the parents, just the men, the women weren't allowed to talk to us. We couldn't really talk, and I didn't speak Arabic. None of my Marines spoke Arabic. They didn't really speak very much English, except maybe what they'd heard in some pop songs. But I started to realize something through that. It was that we're all the same. We wanted the same things. We wanted to go home. They wanted us to go home. They wanted to go home too. We wanted to just be able to go home, and I wanted my parents, I was too stupid to be scared of this, but I wanted my parents to not have to be worried that I was going to take one through the running lights every day I went to work. I just wanted to go home. It was why we had a vested interest in giving them the raw materials and helping them set up and moving them from point A to point B so that you could train their police force, they could rebuild the police barracks, they could rebuild the school, they could rebuild the marketplace, they could install infrastructure so they could have electricity and running water again. And we were doing all that stuff. I wasn't. of supporting the guys who did. We all had a part to play. And I had a vested interest in that, because the sooner we got that done, the sooner I got to go home. The sooner I got to go home, and I was having fun. Again, I was an idiot, but I was having fun. But I realized the sooner I get to go home, that ups my chances of being able to bring all my guys back home and get all of them back to their families. I desperately wanted all my guys to get back home to their families. I was like, we need to finish this. And I realized we wanted the same thing. I wanted the same. I'm looking at these kids, I'm like, you know what? All I really want is for you to grow up and not have to be scared. For you to grow up in peace, not in like lush, posh riches, but in peace, enough that you're not worried about where your next meal is coming from, or you're not worried about whether or not you're getting caught in a firefight on the way to school. That's probably all that kid wanted too. And I realized we're the same. I don't speak the same language as you. I don't worship the same way as you. We dress differently. But we're the same. We want the same things. We both want peace, security, happiness, a good family life. We want to be educated enough to get what we need to through life. Basic creature comforts. We both like listening to music. Maybe not the same music, but we like music. And actually, we probably find that we even agree on a lot of that. I bet I could have, we probably liked some of the same movies. I mean, it was just one of these things you realize, like, you're just like me. And that made me have even more of a vested interest in doing my job well over there. Beyond the one I already had, of helping my guys get back home. I was like, no, it's not just about that. I want them to not have to worry about whether or not their home's going to get attacked when we leave. I started realizing later on, like, that's what solidarity is. It's not just this wishy-washy sentiment. Am I willing to go out and meet the person where they are? To really see things the way they see it. To recognize that across all of these other boundaries and these roadblocks that we put up in the way, can I see the common ground that we both have? And will I work there? Start there. If we don't have very much, can I start there? So like I said, I'm going to share, that was my experience just in a couple of recent wars. I'm going to look back at the Great War, the so-called Great War, World War I, and relate a couple stories that happened towards the beginning of that also capture this idea of, I think, a more authentic solidarity that, again, is and must be rooted in the recognition of the dignity of the person you're talking to. The reason that my Marines and I, when we were able to look out, we saw these kids, we saw their families, and be able to say, you're like me. You want the same things out of this that I do. Why don't we make that happen? It was because we were able to see the dignity of each other. Now, not all of my platoon were Christians. Actually, I know for a fact that at least 2 were Buddhist. I'm still trying to put that together in my head. How can you be a Buddhist Marine? They did it actually very well. Takes all kinds. But I had a very eclectic, diverse platoon. But even if they didn't say it out loud, we recognized God's dignity, the dignity God had placed in each one of these people and in each one of us. That was why we were able to experience that. But you had that, at least at the beginning of World War I. There was a point after which, and I would venture to guess it was probably the Battle of Verdun in 1916, but I'm not positive about that, But there came a point, and the Eastern Front was always a mess. For whatever reason, whether because of the racism, the long-standing wars, just a lot of other general bitterness, the religious dissension, whatever the reasons were, and I think there were a lot of them, it was a very complicated thing, but you never had this kind of humanity out on the Eastern Front, unfortunately, over the course of, from 1914 to 1918. And the Western Front, though, for the first couple of years, sporadically, you would have these things come out of nowhere, where guys on both sides would just quit shooting at each other for an afternoon. Because they would look across the trench and they'd say, he's just like me. And the other guy on the other side of the trench would look across and like, he's just like me. Again, there came a point when I suspect it was the Battle of Verdun that kind of changed that. And then after that, there was too much anger, too much bitterness, too much, literally too much bad blood, too much blood spilled. And there was, and also at that point, several years of conditioning on the part of the upper echelon leadership that didn't like that and was beating it out of the guys. Sometimes actually beating it out of guys to prevent them from looking across the trench and sympathizing with the guy they saw there. So after a certain point on the Western Front, it stopped. But with the first 12 to 18, maybe 24 months, we had these really incredible things that came out that we have like written down in individual people's diaries, in unit diaries, kind of the logbooks that they keep for this stuff. I mean, verified by war correspondents who were out there on the scene. So I'm going to tell you guys a few of these stories here, and also just to keep in mind when this was happening. This was all 1914 and 1915. And think also about how, again, the generals, the politicians, the upper echelon leadership literally had to beat this out of the guys. That their natural movement was towards finding common ground. It was reaching out to the person across from them. And think about the destruction, like that was another thing that we lost in World War I, which, in my opinion, for what it's worth, was probably, I was going to say the most unnecessary war, certainly the most avoidable war that we've probably had in the last couple centuries. You could make an argument probably the least necessary, but it certainly was the most avoidable. Out of all the great wars that have happened in the time of modern warfare, it was the most avoidable, and it's not even, I don't even really think that's up for debate. Which makes this all the more sad, all the more tragic. So, first just a quick show of hands. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Christmas Truce of 1914? Okay, so a few of you guys. Maybe there have been some movies made about this, All Quiet on the Western Front. Some of the stories have been a bit romanticized about what happened, but there's a lot of truth there. Actually, the thing is that because the Christmas truce, and there was actually an unspoken Christmas truce that happened along giant stretches of the Western Front. It wasn't the whole Western Front. There were pockets, there were actually several pockets where men still followed the orders to launch artillery strikes or strafing runs or bombing runs from airplanes. There was some ugly stuff going on Christmas Eve and Christmas in places on the Western Front. But there were also large stretches where men on both sides just agreed. The first Christmas, and unfortunately, as far as I know, the first Christmas only, to for one day stop and celebrate peace on earth, goodwill for those on whom God's favor rests. But it actually started a couple of weeks before that. There's a story that came out on December 11th. This is from the War Diary of the Essex Regiment, and it records a very peculiar truth. By the way, all of the quotes and the things I'm getting right now, I'm pulling from a YouTube channel. It's one of the best research YouTube channels I've ever run across. It's just simply entitled The Great War. You guys know I don't usually make plugs for stuff up here. But the team that puts this kind of thing together, they do a remarkable job, and they came up with this idea back in 2014 that they would walk through World War I week by week, what was happening 100 years ago this week. And it's not just Western Front. they'll go Eastern Front, Africa, Asia. They go all around the world to show how it was really a global conflict. Extremely well researched, very well thought out. I'm somewhere in 1916 right now. I'm playing catch up, and if there's an agenda, I haven't found it yet. They're really just going in there. Like, they're big. If you want to say agenda item, is just simply showing how stupid war is, and how pointless this one was in particular, and how avoidable, and how tragic, and how tragically senseless so much of it was. But they do an excellent job. And I have learned a great deal about a war that really I didn't know very much about. I don't think many of us know very much about what happened, but they go to a lot of like primary sources, like diaries, books written by eyewitness accounts, newspaper articles written like the week after. Very, very well researched. So this is all the stuff that I'm reading here is stuff that they like looked up and they found like an old journal or an old logbook or a diary or letters or books that were written based on the diaries, or oh, here's an old newspaper article. So this is like legitimate stuff that came from like weeks or months after these things happened. So from this war diary, on December 11th, 1914, the war diary of the Essex Regiment records this. It reads thus, quote, "As I told you before, our trenches are only 30 or 40 yards away from the Germans." 30 or 40 yards, wow. This led to an exciting incident the other day. I feel like I should be saying this with a British accent. Okay, whatever. Okay, this led to an exciting incident the other day. Our fellows have been in the habit of shouting across at the enemy, and we used to get answers from them. We were told to get into conversations with them. This is what happened. From our trenches, "Good morning, Fritz." No answer. "Good morning, Fritz." Still no answer. "Good morning, Fritz." From the German trenches, "Good morning." And then from our trench, "How are you?" "All right." "Come over here, Fritz." "No, if I come, I get shot." "No, you won't. Come on." "No fear." I think what he meant to say was, "No, I'm afraid." He said, "No fear." "Come on over and get some cigarettes. Come and get some cigarettes, Fritz." "No, you come halfway, and I meet you." "All right." Still the walk. One of our fellows thereupon stuffed his pockets with cigarettes and got over the trench. The German got over his trench, and right enough they met halfway and shook hands. Fritz taking the cigarettes and giving cheese in exchange. It was good to see the Germans standing on top of their trenches, and the English also, all waving their caps and cheering. About 18 of our men went halfway and met about the same number of Germans. This lasted about half an hour, when each side returned to their trenches to shoot at each other again. What I have written is the truth. But don't think we got chums, as 2 of our fellows were killed the same night, and I don't know how many of them. End quote. Left to themselves, there wasn't a war. Left to themselves, they looked across the trench and they saw a friend. Somebody who swapped cigarettes for cheese. I don't know who won that deal. But they weren't left to themselves, were they? Because you see, the incredible thing is that the British commander, actually a week earlier, General Horace Smith-Darrell, had expressly prohibited that exact thing. I don't know if they didn't get the memo or they just didn't care, but they had been told, don't do that. And the reason, his reasoning was, well, it'll be bad for morale if the men actually, start to like the people on the other side of the trench, instead of seeing them as the enemy. That'll hurt morale, it'll hurt the war effort. No, General, it is just going to hurt your next offensive, because they're not going to want to fight your stupid war. But he recognized that when the trenches were that close, and later on the trenches were a bit further out than 30 to 40 yards. But at that point, he realized that it was very easy to get into a live and let live mentality because you could actually talk to each other across the way, and a lot of the Germans spoke English. And so, of course, they would be talking back and forth, like, hey, we won't shoot at you if you don't shoot at us. Okay, sure, no problem. Why wouldn't you do that? Yeah, I mean, God forbid that two enemies stop hating each other, right? God forbid that they realize they actually have more things in common than they have things that drive them apart. And God forbid that they actually recognize the inherent dignity that each of them have as children of God. God forbid they actually recognize that dignity and respect it, right? Brilliant move, General. Well, apparently that didn't take across the whole line, though, either, because on December 23rd, this is where the all quiet on the Western Front thing kind of starts, a German soldier wrote in his diary that you could hear hymns being sung back and forth across on both sides of the trenches. You have accounts of Christmas trees getting set up above the parapets. And whereas a lot of other times you put something over the parapets they would get shot at, Christmas trees were apparently considered off limits. So PI guys would put Christmas trees up and decorate them. This is all, again, just the first Christmas. On December 24th, there were church services being held in the trenches, and then sometimes in the farmhouse or stuff right behind it. And they were left largely undisturbed. Christmas Eve as well in the evening, and then Christmas Day, there was fighting again, like I said, along limited parts of the front, the Western Front. But despite express orders forbidding fraternization with the enemy, there were giant sections that just basically said, screw it. Especially the British and the Germans. Okay, the French actually didn't always look very nice on the British who did this, because of course they're doing this on French soil. The French are like, hey, they invaded us, you forget that? But the British and the Germans in particular, because there's a common cultural ancestry there, there's a common linguistic ancestry there, and many of the, like I said, many of the Germans spoke English. So the British and German soldiers in particular, there were a bunch of them across no man's land on Christmas Day. They exchanged gifts. They exchanged addresses so they could write to each other's families. They chatted with each other. They sang Christmas hymns together. And we're told there was even a football game. Or, soccer game for us over here. There was a soccer game. The Germans won 3-2. Makes you wonder, what would have happened if you'd said, hey, how about the winner of this game decides the winner of the war? Send our best 11, you send your best 11. We'll get like one of the Swiss to come over and be the referee. They're neutral. There's a soccer game, guys, in no man's land. Because they had more in common than they had tearing them apart. Didn't last though, did it? But about a year later, and this is something November of 1915, it was raining really, really hard all along the Western Front. So much so that there were several parts in the trenches that were flooded, like totally flooded. So Louis Bartha, who was a French soldier who somehow fought on the front lines for 3 straight years and miraculously survived and lived through the war. But he also kept a very detailed journal of stuff and ended up writing a book years later that is one of the best first-hand accounts of what life in the trenches for the common soldier is like that we still have to this day. Louis Bartha, it's spelled Barthas, but I don't speak French, but it's pronounced Bartha. And he writes in his book, Poilu, quote, "In certain places the trenches had completely disappeared underwater. Almost all of the dugouts had collapsed. Our section was lucky enough to have a dugout which was still intact, but one night when the rain came down in torrents, the tide invaded our dugout. The next day, at many places on the front line, the soldiers had come out of their trenches so as to not drown. The Germans had to do the same thing. We therefore had the singular spectacle of two enemy armies facing each other without firing a shot. Frenchmen and Germans looked at each other and saw that they were all men, no different from one another. They smiled, we shared tobacco. A huge devil of a German stood up on a mound and gave a speech which only the Germans could understand. But everyone understood, everyone knew what it meant, because he smashed his rifle on a tree stump. Applause broke out on both sides. If only you had been there, mad kings, bloody generals, fanatical ministers, jingoistic journalists, rear echelon patriots, to contemplate this sublime spectacle. Our big shot leaders were in a furor once the front line was established again, and it was forbidden under penalty of death to leave the trench. Two enemy armies who had been told over and over again, you need to hate each other, standing at each other 50 yards away, 100 yards away, staring at each other, not firing a shot. That rain was pretty awful last night, wasn't it? Yeah. You guys lose your dugout? Yep. Sucks. Yeah, it does. Anything else going on? No. You guys got any cigarettes? Actually, yes I do. Fritz didn't take all of them. So that was the second one there. Two enemy armies facing each other without any prior agreement, saying, nope, I'm not going to shoot at you today. Saying, look at each other, we saw that we were men. They looked at each other and said, you're just like me. You're wet and miserable and cold too. You don't want to be here either. You just want to go home too. Later that same winter, there's a story about how above one of the German parapets, someone had put up a plank that said, the English are fools. A British rifle fire soon destroyed the plank. Very soon after that, another plank appeared above the same parapet. This time it said, the French are fools. That sign was also destroyed this time by French rifle fire. And the third time, soon after that, a third sign went up over the same parapet. We're all fools. Let's all go home. This one was also shot to pieces by the Allied troops on the other trench, but not before causing a great deal of laughter. The soldiers on both sides laughed at the absurdity of the situation they found themselves in. There's a correspondent, their war correspondent, Philip Gibbs, who was there. He wrote about what the men were saying. Quote, there's a good deal of truth in those words. Why should this go on? The fighting men have no real quarrel with each other. But the men were caught in a trap, which Gibbs described this way, quote, loyalty to our own side, discipline with the death penalty behind it, obedience to the laws of war, all the moral and spiritual propaganda handed out by pastors, newspapers, generals, staff officers, old men at home, exalted women. A deep and simple love for England and Germany, pride of manhood, fear of cowardice. 1,000 complexities of thought and sentiment prevented men on both sides from breaking the net of fate in which they were entangled and revolting against that mutual unceasing massacre by arising from the trenches with a shout of, we're all fools, let's all go home. Of course, they weren't fools. They were trying very hard to be in solidarity with each other, to see the dignity of each other. And they were continually being told, stop. the men making the decisions were thousands of miles away, having no clue what was actually going on. So the war continued for 3 whole more years. November 1915 to finally November 1918. 3 more years of slaughter. Senseless, purposeless, meaningless slaughter. Because we couldn't see each other's dignity, because we wouldn't stand in solidarity with one another, and when we tried, when they tried, they were told, no, don't. You can't. The men who started this stupid war, because really the war was started because like 3 or 4 guys really wanted a war. It wasn't, you can even like look past the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That was the match. That was not why there was a war. There were 3 guys. We won't go into that today, but they do. In this YouTube channel, they go into exactly why there was a war. And there were 3 men basically that really pushed for it and wouldn't let it drop. Those 3 men, and all of the men who refused to let the common sense and the common dignity of the men doing the fighting and the dying in the front speak loudly enough to get their attention, have a lot to answer for. This is a history lesson, though. It's about dignity and solidarity. I brought those up because I think those are good at capturing kind of what it means. Solidarity means getting out of your trench and walking across no man's land. And instead of throwing a bullet or a bayonet, you reach out a hand in friendship. I'll meet you halfway, Fritz. Hey, Fritz, come on over here. I'll give you cigarettes. No. You come halfway, I'll meet you there. All right. I'll meet you halfway, Fritz. That's solidarity. If we're not willing to go at least halfway, and I would argue that as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, we ought to go further than just the halfway. But the bare minimum, I would say, is to go halfway. To meet Fritz halfway, to use that example. Another crazier example, this one has a happier ending, and I know I'm a little over, so I'll make this quick. But I ran across this a little while ago with apologies to anyone on the school staff here who may have already had to read this as they're beginning to compile yearbook stuff already. I ran across a story about a man, he's a musician, an African-American musician named Daryl Davis, who was personal friends with several leaders in the Ku Klux Klan. Makes no sense, right? Except it does. You see, when he was a little boy and he experienced racism for the first time, it planted a seed of a question in his mind. And that question was, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And he grew up and he studied music, he went off, he was pretty successful, but the question never went away. How can you hate me when you don't even know me? All right? And I've taken a lot of his words here, so I know I'm not looking at this, but listen to him give a talk on this, or again, it's another, I found a line of this talk that he gave about this. So I'm going to be using a lot of his words, okay? This is not, I'm actually trying to recount this as well as I can. When he had his secretary call up, he found out who the national leader of the Ku Klux Klan was, the KKK. I guess they call him the Imperial Wizard or some such nonsense. But he found out the contact information with this guy somehow. And he had his secretary call him up and say that he wanted to set up an appointment to meet with him, a time to interview. I think he was writing a book or something. He said, but don't tell him that I'm black. He told the secretary, don't tell him I'm black, but I want to talk to him. Well, they had the meeting. It's a little bit of a surprise on both sides at first. It actually almost ended very, very, very badly. But then something kind of unexpected happened that broke the ice, and all of a sudden they both found themselves laughing. The meeting was okay. This other man had made it very clear that he thought he was superior to Daryl, that Daryl was inferior to him. And he would say, "You're not going to be able to change my mind." And Daryl said, "I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to understand yours. I'm just trying to understand. I just want to get an answer to my question." And they had a chat, and then okay. Afterwards, Daryl said, "Hey, can we keep in touch? If I need anything else from you, can I contact you again?" "Yeah, I guess so." "All right, thanks. Thank you very much for your time, sir." "All right, I guess thanks for yours." They got in touch a couple other times. Eventually, Daryl started actually inviting him over to his house. Again, national leader of the KKK coming over to an African American's house. He would often invite a couple of his other friends, one or two of his other friends, to come over and also meet this other man. Sometimes his other friends would be African American, they'd be black, sometimes they'd be white, sometimes they were Jewish. But it was one of these signs was that it was often someone who was part of a group that this guy had already told himself that he hated everyone in that group. And it was a chance for him to meet them and for them to meet him. And they would just sit and they'd talk, and they realized that they didn't agree on most things, but they did find that, amazingly, they agreed on a couple of things, actually. Not a lot of the race stuff. Not race relations, not the separation of races and stuff like that he was, the one guy was big on. Daryl didn't agree with that. He didn't condone anything that the KKK was doing or saying. But he listened. He kept inviting him over to his house, and he started coming over for meals. Daryl started going to KKK rallies. Again, an African-American man showing up to KKK rallies. And he would ask questions. He would listen. And they asked him about stuff. He'd say, "Well, actually, this is what I think. I disagree with you." "Okay, well, why?" He entered into a dialogue. And then an amazing thing happened. Is over the course of several years, Daryl and the national leader of the KKK became friends. And it wasn't just him. He actually became friends with a few other of the local state leaders, too. Because they were meeting him at these rallies. And they were chatting, and he'd invite them over for dinner. And eventually, he started getting invited over to their houses for dinner. And over the course of years, they became friends. They had almost nothing in common. But eventually, that national leader and I think a couple of the other state leaders left the KKK. I believe in large part because of their friendship to a man who walked across no man's land for them. That's solidarity. He had almost nothing in common with them. And he walked all the way across no man's land to find what it was. And by insisting on the recognition of his own dignity, even when it wasn't being given to him, by always recognizing the dignity of the person sitting opposite of him, this man, Daryl Davis, called these people out of themselves and called them across no man's land back to him. That's solidarity in action. That's solidarity as a virtue. Where you don't have a general or a politician saying, "No, you can't love the guy in the opposite trench." So that's kind of in conclusion. I guess we'll just kind of stop there. Just as to wrap up, remember that solidarity was never, I was wrong at the very beginning. Remember? I said, my first idea of solidarity was all wrong. Because solidarity was never about sitting around the campfire, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. That's not solidarity. That's naivete at its absolute worst. We don't get to sit around the campfire and say, everyone show up here. We need to leave the campfire, crawl out of the trenches, run across no man's land with open arms and say, come join us over here. Let me bring you back. There's a campfire. And we see songs that are a lot better than Kumbaya, thank goodness. It's a fun song. It's not that great, right? So, but that's solidarity. It was never that sappy emotion where we just kind of wish problems away. It's the active moving across. Hey, Fritz, come on over here. No. Meet me halfway. Okay, I'll meet you halfway. Sir, can I set up a time to talk to you? I have some questions about your stance on these things. We're probably going to disagree, but that's all right. I just want to listen and try to understand. And what a difference that could make. What a difference that has made and can make in our own lives. That's what solidarity is. It's the big and the small ways that you and I, in our own lives, can plow through the disgusting muck and ugliness of our own humanity that gets in the way so often. Not the human dignity that we ought to present, but the fallen humanity that we usually make the centerpiece. Can we push through that? Can I get up, cross no man's land by recognizing my own dignity and that other guy's, and hoping that I can find at least enough common ground so that I can stop hating him. At the very least, so that we can stop hating each other. At its best, that just like the example we had of St. John Paul II, being able to see Christ in others, and to love Christ in others as we see it revealed through their God-given dignity. Another way perhaps to think of it just very succinctly is this. I have to be able to see Christ in others in order to be Christ to others. Let's pray. All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.